organized by Department of Sociology in collaboration with Department of Women Education, Maulana Azad National Urdu University. I welcome you once again. We know that we are running late a little bit, so because of the lunchtime nearing us. So we'll try to accommodate this plenary session in time. So we have 4 speakers for this session. Professor Gulam Dastagir from Pondicherry University, Professor D. Nagaraju, Department of Sociology, Hyderabad Central University, Professor L. Lam Khan Piang, Department of Sociology, again from HCU, and Dr. Tawseef Fatima, Center for Women Studies, Aligarh Muslim University. I request all of you to please come over the dais. And for this session, we have Chair Professor Arvinder Ansari from Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. I request you, ma'am, to please come over the dais. And we have discussant for this plenary session, Dr. K.M. Ziauddin, Head Department of Sociology. I request him to please come over the dais. Before we begin, a very short introduction of the chair of this plenary session, Professor Arvinder Ansari. Dr. Arvinder Ansari is a distinguished sociologist and professor at Jamia Millia Islamia. Her academic expertise spans sociology of ethnicity and minorities, sociology of gender, feminist theory, cultural studies and identity, and sociology of violence. With over 2 decades of teaching and research experience, she has mentored numerous PhD students and conducted significant research projects addressing issues of social exclusion, gender and minority rights. She has a lot of research projects to her credit, which I can't go in detail. You can just Google ma'am's name and you will come to know about the academic work she has to her credit. She has a lot of books also. Notable publication I just like to highlight is through her Being a Minority in India, Issues and Challenges, which was published in 2016, and Inter-Religion Marriages in Indian Society, Issues and Challenges, to 2013, and Communalization of Indian Society. And she has also contributed various articles to international and national journals covering themes as a Muslim women activism, social exclusion, communal violence, and gendered perspective of development. I think no one else than Madam would be an apt chair for this plenary session. I welcome you, ma'am, to this plenary session. And I request Dr. Vivekanand to please felicitate Madam with a memento and bouquet and a shawl. I request Dr. K.M. Ziauddin to do the honor. Thank you. We have discussant for this plenary session, Dr. K.M. Ziauddin. A very brief introduction of his also. He's an associate professor and head department of sociology, MANUU. He has also worked towards the minorities perspectives, especially on Muslim women, child labor, Dalit studies, ethnographic research, and eventually he'll come to know about his work while he speaks. So I welcome you all. Welcome you also as a discussant in this plenary session. I request Dr. Vivekanand to give the memento to the discussant of this. No? Okay. Later on we'll do it. Okay, fine. Thank you. So we'll just open the floor for the discussion now. I now, as and when I'll invite the speakers to throw light on, I'll give a brief introduction of them. As we know that in the inaugural session only, Professor G. Aloysius has thrown light on the debate. He has opened the debate on the theme. He said that Every person is claiming to be a subalternized community now, and in this context, it is very important to discuss the intricacies of different intersections like caste, religion, ethnicity, gender, and how they contribute towards the marginalization and exclusion of subaltern communities. So let us start this discussion and delve more into the understanding of this theme and the phenomena of subaltern communities, where we have a very vibrant panel on the dais who would throw light on the theme of the seminar with their wide understanding and expertise. So first, I would like to invite Professor Gulam Dastagir to throw the light on the theme of today's. I think in the first billion of the hands. He is a distinguished academic from the Department of Sociology at Pondicherry University. I welcome you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. Respected professors, Professor Arandhari Sari Madam, Professor Aloysius, Professor Zia, Professor Nagaraju, and Madam, all on the dais, dignitaries on the dais and dignitaries of the dais, dear research scholars and my dear students. It gives me immense pleasure to be part of this event, an event of first of its kind. Let us give a big round of applause to Professor Zia for making this landmark event in the history of sociology. I would say that for two reasons. First of all, calling this as subaltern, a study on subaltern communities, a conference on subaltern communities, as a national seminar on subaltern communities, you can Google out to find out as you do it. Okay, perhaps this is the first of its kind that Professor Zia could materialize. He has been instrumental and he has been successful in making it possible. Secondly, I would appreciate Professor Zia and his team and the entire university for coming up with this idea of talking about the subaltern communities of South India. This is quite important. Always we talk about some issues of national character, issues of global character, but then many of the time we also miss out what goes beneath them. What goes beneath them? Underneath, what remains underneath? As Professor Aloysius spoke about students presenting on micro perspective, and we do, resource persons will take on to a macro perspective, and then we do have certain interface between these two, micro-macro interface. But then what is quite important is to trace the kind of issues and challenges at, the question is this, at every level. We do agree that we have to understand society from a post-structuralist perspective, which makes an important statement that none of the communities are homogeneous. The heterogeneity is part of life. And then that heterogeneity has to be understood in both in unison and both in as well as in isolation. We have to then only the comprehensive understanding of each and every community and its the challenges as well as the possibilities of development or underdevelopment could be grasped in its right sense. We claim sociology to be a comprehensive science, a comprehensive subject, comprehensive study, comprehensive research. But then how do we achieve it? This is the one which we require to look at the ways by which we can identify those areas which are remaining marginalized, which are remaining subalternized, and those areas need to be brought to the mainstream discussion. That is how this national seminar assumes a great significance in the history of sociology in India. And speaking about subaltern, Professor Aloysius initiated a keynote with several questions of how do we understand. But the point is this, we speak about subalterns, then we always go into the repeated and beaten track kind of an inquiry, a beaten track kind of an assumption, hypothesis, and beaten track kind of a discourse, saying that my subalterns has to be understood in terms of socio-economic, cultural, religious, educational. Well, these spheres of life do depict the subaltern's position, but then they talk about the subaltern as something that is excluded, something that is deserving kind of support for empowerment, and that is something discriminated. There is kind of a disparity. But then what has to be done to really to get into the idea of subaltern is not enough to do with socio-economic, cultural, political, socio-cultural, religious dimensions. Why I say this is the very concept of subaltern. We need to get into that dialogue first. I guess the idea of subaltern itself, etymologically speaking, is drawn from the idea of subordination. The mass, the folk, the marginalized, and this kind of a segment has to be understood. How do we understand this? The very important component that comes into the picture is not socio-economic, cultural, religious, educational realms. But what is more important here, I would say, it is power. When we talk about subalterns, we need to speak in terms of power distribution. The dimension of power assumes priority here. When we speak about power, it is not just about, many people may also assume that we talk about politics. Power is not politics alone. Power is everywhere. We take Antonio Gramsci, we take Michel Foucault, and we could understand the concept of the hegemony. And there we can also locate, if you want to have a simplistic understanding of subalterns, we can make it by understanding a kind of a binary. A dichotomy can be possible to be understood. Yes, the dominant versus subaltern, the ruled versus rulers. Okay, so ruler versus ruled. Well, what we have this idea coming with Darendorf. All these thinkers have already contributed to this idea in many ways, but that has not been brought to the mainstream of sociological discussion. Never this has been a part of sociological discourse, unfortunately, so far. But now, probably the MANUU, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, has taken this lead for the first time to talk about subalterns as an important social category, which has to be understood in a sociological realm, sociological discourse. And also addressing the way by which our director of Symbiosis spoke about from a law point of view, from a constitutional point of view. We do have various constitutional provisions that speak about how the minorities and people, the depressed classes have to be supported by various governmental kind of schemes, as well as policies, and also governmental provisions of constitutional guarantees. But then I am reminded of this small incident. I think we can also listen to this. There have been a group of guests who came to somebody's house, and they were offered, now like we are offered tea today, like that they were also asked to take some tea. And when they were offered a tea on a table, there were certain boxes which were kept there already. So when the tea was placed on the table, some of them felt that their tea is lacking sugar. So they wanted to try out adding sugar to the tea. Okay. When they wanted to add sugar to the tea, there was a box kept there with a spoon, and that on the box there is a label written sugar. So if you see there is a box written with sugar, what you do? Now you need not ask anybody, right? So the box sugar is there. So you open up, take the spoon, and put that content into your tea. You stir it, then now you taste it. What do you get? It should be sweet, right? Yes. But then what has happened? It was not sweet. It was salty. Because the box carries the label sugar, but what was kept inside was salt. My dear students and research scholars and faculty, I would tell you that constitutional provision speaks of various provisions, but then constitutional provisions are not sufficient. They are necessary, but they are not sufficient. Because all that goes with what we have to reach to the people who are deserving it has to be done through governmentality, enforcement, the implementation of those provisions. Who will do that? Who will do that? Constitution, can it do by itself? Can it do it by itself? It can't do it by itself. What it requires a political will. It requires a political support. Well, not only political support, it requires a dimension called power, where people who are not in the political realm as well as can participate in terms of lobbying or interest groups. They can do this kind of influencing the policymakers. But then where is that power? The question is, do the subalterns have power to do this? Do these subalterns have power to encounter with the dominant classes, dominant groups? As we go back to the idea of history, it would be usually mentioned that talking about subaltern is extension of history, because originally history never spoke about subaltern. History was the history of the story of the elite. You must have read that history speaks about kings, queens, the royal empire, this, that. Well, and what is that history all about? It is about society of the elite. And where are these people who were serving them? They were never into the picture of history. Therefore, the subaltern, speaking about subaltern from a historical point of view, will require to say that it is an extension of history, a new history, not just a modern history. It is a new history and it is a contemporary history. In the political realm, again, as I told you already, it is not just about talking about who has to be attended to. It is all about how every citizen has to participate. When it comes to this question of citizenship, where is the role of subaltern? Who is a subaltern? Subaltern is a citizen on paper who doesn't get the privileges of being a citizen. There is a question of citizenship which goes in terms of what is given on records. Record-based citizenship versus the spirit of citizenship. There is a dichotomy, there is a hiatus between what is on record and what is actually followed. There is a very big hiatus between what is possible and what is actual. And this is what we call it as the fate of the subaltern, the experience of the subaltern. So taking forward this kind of idea, I would like to also take you to a kind of, my position to explain to you the situation of subaltern. May I have the PowerPoint? Is it possible? Okay, I'll wind up now. Okay, so no need of PowerPoint. This is a limited time. So just I will tell you, I have conducted a study for this purpose specifically, that when we speak about subaltern, I have perused through the literature across globally, what is kind of subaltern literature available from 1980s. And then I found that there is a mention of certain communities in that. We know peasants are subalterns, workers are subaltern. And in that category comes in Dalits subaltern, Muslim subaltern. But I could not find the idea of tribe. But then there are depressed classes which are, I guess we can include subaltern tribes. But then there is no mention about Christians being treated subaltern. But I would say in India, we need to talk about Christians as subaltern. Okay, that is what Professor Zia has done in his concept note as well. And I have conducted a study about how these subaltern communities are represented in Indian Parliament. So I have done a study which is there in the PowerPoint. Maybe we can share to you in our group, and then you can look at it. I have found that in our the South Indian all states put together and union territories put together, how do we define South India? Andhra Pradesh, Okay, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, and the Union Territory Pondicherry and Lakshadweep. So this constitutes the South Indian territory. So I have done a study to find out from 2004 to 2024 how the electoral politics have worked, which I called it as, I have titled my work as the frontiers of subaltern politics in South India. The frontiers of subaltern politics. And that I found that the Constitutional Delimitation Committee 1976 had made certain provisions for reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And then because of that, in 2004, some constitutions were occupied by scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, not more than the reserved seats. And again in 2008, there was a revision. The Constitutional Delimitation Committee had revised the reservation provisions, because of which the reservation also was little increased. So the increase was something like this. In South India, in 2004, there are 19 seats for scheduled caste and 3 seats for scheduled tribes. Whereas from 2009 onwards, it has increased to 21 seats for scheduled caste and 5 seats for scheduled tribes. And all these times, all these 5 periods of election, we find that these seats are only occupied by the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe only on the basis of reservation. Okay, so this provision, because of this provision, then we also looked into the way in which Muslims represent. In Muslim representation, there has been a systematic decline in the representation of Muslims in the Indian Parliament from South India. In 2004, there were 7 representatives. In 2009, there were 6 representatives. And 2014 onwards, 2014, 19 and 24, there are only 5 representatives from Muslim communities in the Indian Parliament. So this shows that, again, I compared it with the population of each state, where I found in Karnataka, there are 12% of Muslims, but no MP of Muslim there. None of the Muslim communities represented in Indian Parliament, though there are 12% of Muslims living there. Right? So this way in Andhra Pradesh, particularly after this bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, the 1 seat that was with Andhra Pradesh has gone to Telangana. Telangana has 1 Muslim representative, but Andhra Pradesh also, though it has 9.5% Muslim population, it doesn't have any representative in the Indian Parliament. So these are some of my key observations I have got in my PowerPoint, but then I have just given you a gist. Why I have done this, let me also tell you. The idea of subaltern is not just to talk about their religious, cultural, social, economic, and educational spheres, but we have to get into the dialogue in terms of the power dimension which is involved. And speaking about this power dimension, we also need to comprehend that power is everywhere. Power is everywhere. In the sphere of economy, liberalization has brought about so much of development, where the chief guest also spoke that India is now competing with global global key players. But then it is almost looks like this, that when there are anybody has like this, 2 hands are there, but one hand is growing longer, but the other hand is becoming shorter. And this kind of a development is called, how do we call this? Crippled development, skewed development. So in the skewed development, who has to be brought to the focus? Who has to be brought to the limelight? Yes, it is the subaltern who are missing out from this. What about market? We call it as liberalization has brought this trinity of market, trade, and individualism. And what it is doing for the individuals? Well, people who can compete, those who have capital, they are able to grow. And people who are into the working class, they continue to be marginalized, suppressed, and various forms of discriminations are there with them. Okay, so this is the kind of situation where subaltern needs to be understood. So considering the paucity of time, let me conclude by saying a small story to you. Ready to listen to the story? Okay. There was, okay, just 30 seconds. Okay. After a cyclone storm, okay, an old man walks into the beach and finds there is a young boy, doing something at the seashore. And as he went close to him, he found that boy is picking up something and throwing into the sea. Then that old man asked, "What are you doing?" He said, "Because of this cyclone storm, the waves have brought all the starfishes on the seashore, and I am trying to, once the sunshine comes up, due to heat, these starfishes may die. So I am picking them and putting them back to the sea." Then the old man asked, "Like this, so many starfishes would be there on the seashore. Then what are you doing?" Then he said, he picked up one more starfish, threw it back to the sea and said, "It makes a difference for the starfish which has gone into the sea because it can continue to live." This is the status of subalterns. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm really sorry that we couldn't hear you much, but you made significant presentation. What you're talking about your presentation, surely we'll share with the scholars in the groups. Thank you so much. And you made a very significant point that who is to be attended is not important, but how is to be attended is more important in terms of power dynamics. Thank you so much for your presentation. Our next speaker is Professor G. Nagaraju. He is a distinguished sociologist and head of the Department of Sociology at HCU. He has authored several research papers on education and hegemony. I request you, sir, to be short in your...
Sure.
And I request the chair also to intervene if they are going beyond the time. So time, madam, how much time?
10 minutes. Okay.
So I requested to please. Yeah.
Okay. So, respected Chair, Professor Arvinder Ansari, and co-panelist, and I'm extremely thankful to my dear friend, Professor Ziauddin, for this great opportunity and also for creating a space for a festival of ideas. I'm so happy to see Professor Aloysius, Professor Muhammad, Professor Najibullah, Professor Nageswara, and several scholars who are present here, and also my colleague. I'm really thankful to all of you. And when you're talking about the idea of subaltern studies, it's primarily considered as the domain of the historians. The role of sociologists and anthropologists in engaging with the ideas and methodologies, epistemologies of subaltern studies were not at all given much importance in the Indian sociology and Indian anthropology. So though most of the scholars in Indian anthropology, they tend to claim themselves as a specialist on tribal communities, but they fail to analyze the agency of the tribal communities. Rather, they tend to romanticize the tribal knowledge systems. So in a sense, they were known for retaining the spirit of the stigma, which are primarily attached by the colonial ethnographers as well as anthropologists. So when you look at the idea of sociology as a branch of knowledge in the context of Indian society, though there are a number of attempts by the scholars, but the dominant sociological traditions are primarily driven by the structural functionalist methodologies and so on and so forth. So the idea here is that when you look at the role of subalterns with reference to the Dalits, Adivasis, Muslim minorities, and Christian minorities, how to locate the epistemological spaces of these communities in the Indian sociology with special reference to the South India. That's where I try to use the South India as a spatial location in order to interrogate some of the basic assumptions and presumptions which are associated with the idea of the subaltern in the Indian sociology. So when you look at the Indian sociology and its engagement with the subaltern communities, with reference to South India, there are though scholars like Louis Dumo, who is known for making great interventions way back to 1960s, as well as before Dumo, people like M.N. Srinivas, who made a systematic attempt to understand the idea of Indian society. But both M.N. Srinivas and Louis Dumo were known for approaching the Indian society from the top. So therefore, we hardly find the the sociology of the Dalits, sociology of Adivasis, as well as sociology of Muslim minorities in the South Indian villages. So that means we're talking about the South Indian village, whose village Professor M.N. was trying to convey. When we are talking about the notion of, let's say, the Tamil village of, let's say, Louis Dumo, whose let's say, ideas he was trying to convey. So when you look at the ideas of both M.N. Srinivas and Louis Dumo, they were known for legitimizing the symbolic forms of discrimination by negating the experiences of the Adivasi communities, especially the Dalits and Muslim minorities, who are very much part of the South Indian village structure. I think when this is where we need to decode the very idea of Indian village, especially from South Indian village, from the subaltern agency as well as subaltern methods. So way back to 1970s, there was one of the famous American anthropologists by name Mencher. She was the first person who made a systematic attempt to understand the idea of an Indian village, especially the South Indian village, from the subaltern perspective. She was one of the first person by undertaking a field work in 5 villages of Chengalpet district, where she was trying to convey what is the nature of the relation between class and caste with reference to Dalits, and why the Dalits are primarily deprived of their agency, why the Dalits are deprived of their economic, political agency in the Tamil villages. I think this is where, dear friends, we need to understand that the very idea of an Indian village need to be approached from the lens of the Dalits as well as the Muslim minorities as well as the Christians. Why I'm making this kind of claims is that these communities constitutes a very significant number, but unfortunately most of the sociologists and anthropologists, both from India and abroad, were known for undertaking the dominant methodologies and dominant epistemologies as their point of entry. So now the important question is, what are the important interventions of the Dalit scholars with reference to mapping the field of knowledge with reference to South India? If you go into details, the South India is considered as one of the, let's say, sociological experimental lab compared to the other parts of India. So that's where way back to the early part of the 20th century, the non-Brahmin movement was one of the dominant mode of protest in the context of Madras presidency. So therefore, the subaltern communities, especially the Dalits, were one of the key members of, or key communities which was part of the non-Brahmin movement. So when you look at the implications or outcome of the non-Brahmin movement, so though it was primarily enabled the dominant caste, especially the Shudra, the upper layers of the Shudra community, to emerge as a dominant caste in the post-independent India, but at the same time, this non-Brahmin movement also paved the way for the modernization of Dalit community at one level. So this is where I wish to argue that the non-Brahmin movement, as well as the role of the Christian missionaries and the egalitarian agenda adopted by the British India, was one of the important players in the making of a Dalit agency as an alternative spaces of articulation as well as assertion. So therefore, when you take the idea, at the time of independence, the Dalit society or Dalit civil society was slowly gaining importance. So the idea of Dalit autonomous movements were very much active, both in different parts of the Madras presidency, including in Hyderabad. So therefore, by 1947, the Dalit, one set of Dalit intellectual communities was trying to articulate the agenda for independent India. I think that's where, when you look at the Dalits as a subaltern community, Dalits were primarily, let's say, because of their protest movements, because of the accession movement, the Dalit agenda to a certain extent was adopted in the context of Indian Constitution in the form of some of the basic, let's say, constitutional provisions in the lines of the affirmative action policy and all. So now the question is, from 1947 to 1990s, one can say that there was one class of Dalits. There was a middle class which emerged among the Dalit section, but unfortunately, it also created a paradox of the uneven development, a paradox of ideological, let's say, contestation among the Dalits. So when you look at all the South Indian state, in every state, only one particular Dalit caste, or maximum only two castes among the, let's say, 58 or 60 or 70 Dalit castes, they became they were relatively advanced. Their presence was very much felt in uh, diverse spaces with reference to the state space as well as the civil society. But from 1990s onwards, there was an alternative movement which came from within. So that's where one has to understand that the contestations from above to within. So the marginal caste among the Dalits, in the case of Andhra Pradesh, in the case of Karnataka, in the case of Tamil Nadu, they started asserting for the subcaste categorization among the Dalit communities. So therefore, we are talking about the idea of a subaltern. We need to substantiate who is the subaltern, or is there any need to talk about the subalterns among the subalterns. So therefore, when you look at methodologically, as a student of sociology, when you take the positivism as a methodological protocol, we need to be very much attentive to the multiple margins, because even after 75 years of independence, we are not in a position to see the presence of the remaining 58 castes. Not only forget about the colleges and university, even the schools, we are unable to see their presence. So therefore, this is one of the greatest failure of the developmental agenda initiated by the government of India in general and all the state governments in South India in particular. So, but now the point is that even after, let's say, the 75 years of independence, but one of the major issue which confronting the Dalit agency is all about the self-respect. But despite of, let's say, educational advancement or relative economic mobility in the form of government jobs and all, but still the sense of the sense of purity and pollution is very much guiding the South Indian states. So that's where the number of honor killing has become one of the important now. So that's where one need to understand that there's a fundamental difference between caste and class. So most of the scholars, they tend to assume that class has the potential to encompass the class identity. Of course, the class has some kind of potential. It may encompass this caste identity only to 30% or maximum 20%, that too only in the public space. But when you look at the private space, the caste is the sociological reality. So the outcome of the caste prejudice were primarily manifested in the form of the honor killings, not only by the upper caste killing the Dalits, even among the OBCs were also known for killing the Dalits. So therefore, the idea of a Dalit as a human being is yet to be recognized. So therefore, we are talking about the idea of a citizen. How to understand the idea of a citizen? Whether the Dalits were referred as untouchable communities 100 years ago or until 1947, what is their status in the 21st century? So that's where, dear friends, we need to understand the methodological challenges opened by scholars like Gail Ahmed when she is talking about the idea of Dalits and democratic revolution. And on the other hand, scholars like Eleanor Gillette, who talks about from untouchable to Dalits. And also, there are a number of scholars who try to argue that the Dalit society is undergoing a change. But as I am trying to argue that, what is the nature of the change? I think whether the change is emancipatory change or if the change is primarily taking place with a sense of stigma. I think this is an open-ended question. I wish to stop here. I'm extremely thankful to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. You made very significant point at how caste intersects with the identity of subaltern communities, and also you throw light on the methodological challenges that a scholar must keep in mind while they research on the subaltern communities. Thank you very much for making valuable points. Now, our next speaker would be Professor Ellam Khan Piang from Department of Sociology, HSU. His research interests are also encompasses ethnicity, identity, nation and nationalism, tribal studies, border studies, health system, research and quantitative techniques. Notably, his work is History Binds Us. His academic journey reflects a commitment to exploring complex social issues, particularly those affecting marginalized communities in the Northeast India. I welcome you and request you to please make your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the time, and thank you for Dr. Jaidins and friends, everyone, and then the organizing team for giving me this opportunity. And I'd like to thank the universities also and the Department of Sociology and everyone. Today, the topic, which is something revisiting Dalit minorities and tribal studies in South India. And then I should say that I will not be able to do justice much, especially as it is South India, which I come only 4 years ago, and then we are totally quite apart. And then, but anyway, the very fact that the kind of what it is that is revisiting, this revisiting part in the South India is really difficult for me to really tackle, in the sense like in South India I have never visited before, and then to revisit again is something which is really a difficult task. Of course I tried, and then I may not be able to do justice to that one, but however the main thing, the tribal is not necessarily that I have to speak about the tribal studies. And then to begin with, I'd like to share one particular things which really haunted me when we were in class A. Those days, it must be equivalent to the preparatory. We were taken to Jews, and then what I saw that time, which really traumatized for quite some time, and then it do have a lot of meaning to me, is that they keep in a cage a snake and a chicken. Anytime when the snake is hungry, the snake has to eat the chicken. That putting them totally in that kind of a cage is really haunted me. At the same time, how do we become subaltern in the first place? That the subalternization, becoming a subaltern, and then the very fact that othering within, the others within. If we just look at tribal studies, especially the kind of studies, how it is started. Of course, anthropology may be the first discipline which studies tribals and the stateless society as such. If we consider all those studies in tribes, obviously anthropologists may be the first. And then if we just look at how the anthropologists' studies are really empowering also, we could see that if we just look at that for quite some times in Europe, what we could see is Enlightenment movement, and then the other side is Romanticism. And then it has some kind of a root from Romanticism. And the father of nationalism, who is being called the father of nationalism, Johann Gottfried von Herder, they are the one who is the key in the Romanticism movement. Those days, their work inspired many of the students, and Adolf Bastian is one of them. And Adolf Bastian's student is Franz Boas, who is a cultural anthropologist and then the father of anthropology in the United States, we can say that. And then the way he is, all the kinds of methodology which he come up with, like cultural relativisms, historical particularisms, all these are really empowering for the kind of what we call now subaltern or the others, especially the others group. And then that is how we have to understand in their own way, in the cultural context, that contextuality comes in. And this is something which we are, which we could see that even the kind of anthropologies, what has been going on in US, really empower in a sense like for the indigenous people, that kind of concept also could comes, and that recognition is also for the other community is there. And then that is some kind of a things which we can see, understanding the native or the First Nations as in the indigenous peoples and all that kind of things we could see. So basically, it is the study of the others that really, of course, you could see that there were a lot of travelogue before anthropology as a discipline comes. But when the social philosophy and then the travelogue empirical data, when it fused together, then it becomes a discipline, the kind of the scientific studies of anthropology. So this is something what I would like to look at. And then if we just look at the kind of subaltern communities, which is, for example, the Muslims and the Muslim communities, and then the Dalit communities, the tribal communities, three main, and then now just also included the Christian communities. They are located in various places, and then their kind of historical experience is totally different. And then here, if I have to do everything, then it will we have the paucity of times, and that. So I'll just concentrate on the tribal studies, and that the tribal studies is the way it has been. It is mainly how it has been studied the tribal communities during the colonial during the colonial time, the colonial administration trying to understand. Of course, there is a kind of emperor, the Mughal emperor, and all that kind of things. They replace that one. And then after that, during that time, the tribal have their own existence still with the territory they occupy. But if we just look at that one, and they have this, what we call, that certain kind of isolation, and then they want to penetrate that one. When they started privatizing the territory and then trying to cultivate various other cash crops like tea, coffee, and all that kind of things, and that they would like to have. And then that was never a kind of a penetrable area, especially if we just look at the notice also. The people who are having the problem till now, the Zhou people, which I call the Kukichin groups, they are the last one to be conquered. That's why their problem has not been solved in many ways, that the problem is still going on. Okay, so that's the same thing as that. If we just look at Bangia Bukio's writings about the Gon, and then how the sovereignty has been negotiated, and then how those various other things, the kind of negotiation that took place with the colonial state and all the things that he talks about. And then the other thing is that sometimes many of the people who are doing research in India, especially when it comes to the tribal, they are following the footsteps of the colonial master or the colonial administrator and trying to understand in various ways, and then the culture, the practice, the customary, and all that kind of things, and then hardly talk about the kind of political problem which they are facing, and then how they are being looked at as the others. Even the Nehruvian paternalistic way of looking at, if we just look at the pencil, and the language is something which, if we just look at that one, there is kind of othering that happens. People, the specific what I'll just mention it, as you all already knows about it. We should try to encourage and then that very word we others the tribal community, and then tribal rights and to land and the forest should be respect, and then all the kind of the pencil, if we just look at that, their own people, that kind of things, to avoid introducing too many others in their tribal territory, over administration in their area. That kind of ordering is there, and then that is something which is appreciated in the sense like understanding, recognitions, and all. How far they are benefiting that kind of recognition is something which is something to be asked. And then so if we just look at that, for those people, the tribals, understanding and recognition is one thing which is very important. Of course, they do recognize in various ways, but if we just look at that, can be we can just look at that like Frantz Fanon's way of looking at like decolonization, where they talk about that one. He said that replacements of certain species by man, certain species of man by another species without any period of transition, just complete and abolition, obsolete substitution. Those are the things, and then many of the things which I would like to concentrate is not likely going to. So I will just take another 3 minutes just to say, yeah, two minutes, okay. And then if it is that, I'll just put the question, the main question which I like to put, because one thing, if we just look at various tribal studies, and then their main objective is to document and research their culture, custom, practices, and all these things. That is the main thing. But people hardly talk about why they become subaltern, and then how can you really tackle the kind of political situations which they have been. And then so in that one, in concluding remarks, I'd like to put a question is that, do we really have tribal studies as subfield of interdisciplinary? That is something which I ask myself. And then we tend to say that tribal studies, if we just look at Andhra, there is a tribal university in Andhra Pradesh also. And then the department itself, also the tribal studies department, and then the kind of objective which they set is mainly to document and research all these kind of things, what I just mentioned. And then theoretical framework has to be employed. We are totally out of those which are very empowering, like cultural relativisms and historical particularisms and all these things. Is it merely documentation that is being called tribal studies? How can we really advocate the bottoms-up kind of a methodology, which perspective, which TK Women's also talks about that one? Is it okay to continue to treat the various tribes as the other without benefiting such treatment in terms of self-rule? Because they are considered as not fitted to be self-rules. And then till now, if I'm just coming back to the kind of story which I just mentioned, the snake and the chicken, or the python and the chicken in the cages. So that way, when people are being caged with the kind of a frame of a state, then there is a kind of that is the process of subalternizing the people, and then they cannot really use their agency to really have their own way, and then to have their self-rule and all the things. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for throwing light on subaltern communities, especially with special reference to tribal studies. I'm sure your presentation has added knowledge to the scholars who want to work on tribal studies. Thank you once again. Now our last speaker is Dr. Tausif Fatima, who is Assistant Professor at Center for Women Studies, Aligarh Muslim University. With a background of BA, LLB, and on gender issues. She has worked, various writings have been done on gender issues. I'm sure she'll throw light on how gender will intersect with the theme. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank Department of Sociology and Department of Women Education for making me a part of this learning process where scholars like Aloysius is there. So yes, before I start, I would like to mention that my research is based in archival sources, and being someone who is not located in the field, and so my insights are purely based on documentary evidence and not in the lived experience. And it would be one of the limitations. So I would like to take you to the colonial legal framework and obviously the women's question. So in addition to the fact that it has a direct bearing on the edifice of modern legal system in India, the colonial legal history has not only shaped people's lives and interactions with the state, but also classified the Indian people and their differences on the basis of imperial understanding. The colonial administration has traversed through complex and uneven terrains, where one witnesses a peculiar relationship between law and custom evolved across regional trajectories. And here we would be focusing on the South India specifically, and the proclaimed civilizing mission which changed its tenor if we compare the pre-1857 and post-1857 period. The establishment of colonial rule in India assured an era of codification of laws and judicial reviews amidst the existing plurality of laws, customs, and usages. It was not the case that law and state was not there, but not in the way as the European way. So the quest of the colonial state to bring legal uniformity has brought alterations to the customary practices and also to the lives of the people who were already situated at the peripheries, thereby making a case for unearthing and revisiting the legal history to find those unheard voices. In its attempt to maintain law and order, the British colonial state employed techniques of governance using legal, juridical, and institutional apparatuses of administration. During the process of governance, we had seen through a number of specific interventions that people became those sites through which the colonial rule was justified, and a sort of collaboration with the dominant groups emerged, be it the construction of certain tribes, groups, or individuals as criminals through the passage of Criminal Tribes Act 1871, or the criminalization of Devadasis, or the exclusion of agricultural land from the purview of the Shariat Application Act 1937, the notion of criminality associated with Mapilas of Malabar, or the penetrations made to the matrilineal practices of Marumakattam law in certain regions of South India. All such attempts reflect the urge to retain colonial domination, where we see that how certain groups who are not conforming to the British idea, were of norms, stability, settled practices, settled agriculture, were considered, were categorized as deviants. So within the legal framework, the relevance and this legal framework or anywhere else, we see that the court cases are valued not only as one of the sources of law, but also for providing details about the different actors involved in the process of litigation, and obviously positioned in a particular context and time, because the cases provide an insight about the period as well. Social norms, so we see that these case laws become a source to examine complex life, social norms, and judicial attitude. However, this is also important to note that these judgments cannot be considered as indisputable and verifiable claims. Therefore, the other details of the court proceedings and the broader social context become crucial in understanding the implications of these legal rulings. Therefore, opening up the possibility of going beyond these legal rulings and beyond what was merely palatable to the courts. So it is found that through a series of case laws, colonial judiciary brought alterations into the norms, practices, and lives of native people. For instance, and this is very important, that before its and we can see this process in a number of interventions, that before its criminalization, the customary practice of Devadasis was made equivalent to prostitution through a series of judicial pronouncements, because first we saw that there was a reluctance to provide legal recognition to the customary practices, and finally we had seen the denial of their customary rights at all. So when it comes to examining and deconstructing case laws adjudicated by the High Court of Madras during the colonial period, it can be said that the contestation and interpretations of women's claims within the judicial spaces seem to be intertwined. Intertwined with what? With the conflict between legal recognition to the plurality of customs on the one hand, and vis-a-vis the quest of the colonizers to bring uniformity. So we see that I would just quickly take this particular case study, where the unfolding of the issue of Hindu widows' remarriage in Madras High Court reflects the caste-based diversity did not make any difference in the rigid interpretation of the act. Therefore, the way law got interpreted by the court proved detrimental to the interest of women who belong to a particular caste, and by the caste itself they were allowed to remarry, and they were also allowed to retain the rights in the property of the deceased husband. But with the way act got interpreted, it actually the rule of forfeiture was applied, and it proved detrimental to their interest, and it did reverse to the position of those women. So another peculiar nature of cases coming before the court involved this very interesting category, Parda Nashin women. Though belonging to a category of propertied women, colonial judiciary granted them special legal protection owing to their weakness and ignorance resulting from their seclusion and regressive social order. So what do we see? That these women executed different kinds of deeds, and the rule that was applied here, that this onus of proof of the fairness of transaction depended on those who benefited out of these deeds. So we see that in I'll not take the case in detail, but in one of the cases, the Madras High Court held that the rule could not be applied to all the cases of Parda Nashin alike, and depending upon the circumstances, which includes the agency and ability of women, the rule can be rebutted. So the case laws coming before the court provide a fascinating insight into the functioning of colonial judiciary in terms of what principles, rules, and texts were invoked and what were silenced, because there exists in this legal landscape a very interesting idea of exclusion and inclusion. What is being taken into and what is not taken into consideration. So the adjudication of such disputes often revealed the intersection of caste, gender, and religion in legal decision making, where colonial judges attempted to interpret indigenous customs as per their own understanding and legal frameworks, leading to distortions and selective recognition of traditions. This is also very important, and we see it in a number of cases, that this idea of selective recognition. One finds prevalence of non-uniformity and inconsistency in the manner in which disputes were resolved. Also, sometimes the functioning of colonial legal framework aligned with the interest and reinforced the dominant interest, mostly of men, and ultimately protected the imperial interest. So just one last point, the role of, we have seen a number of existing work in this direction have already, and those works have highlighted the possibility and scope of future research. And because Sir has mentioned, yes, I'll not take two, I'll take one. So, yes, so Professor Ghulam Dastagir had mentioned about the policy thing. So I will also like to bring your attention, the attention of this house, to the brittle condition of the archives, because it needs our attention, the attention of the policymakers, and the academia must push this demand, so that this possibility of digging out those voices should not go out of our hands, and we can save this possibility before the paper crumbles into our hands. Because not only I have experienced this, a number of other scholars who are interested in the field of legal history have documented this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tausif Fatima. You made a wonderful point while stating colonial judiciary and intricacies between the judgment and with respect to women especially. Thank you so much. Before I call upon the chair, I would like Dr. K.M. Ziauddin, Head Department of Sociology, to make his comments as a discussant for this plenary session.
I think many of you would have read by the kind of diversity we had on the dais as panelists. That intention was that to bring some of the component which we have been trying to conceive as subaltern. In addition to that, I mean, if you see the kind of questions which comes up from Professor G. Nagaraj's talk, and then ideas that comes about relocating the studies from the methodological perspective, and also locating Dalit studies in southern context. How do we do that? That is one of the challenge, and then these challenges comes only when we go deep down into the field experiences and then document those all those theoretical premises we have, sociological, whether we talk about Louis Dumont's study or Emily Cinemas, but then what is happening today in southern Indian context is more important. And that is why I thought the kind of questions which Professor Nagaraj put through historically understanding Madras presidency, when you have those studies, whether Hyderabad Nizam, then what kind of studies we have. These are some questions which we need to be deliberating into that context. But prior to that, most important thing which I could understand, and that comes to me, what Professor Ghulam Dastagir was talking about, the kind of territorial lining the subaltern in South Indian context. I'm not sure, because we have many more here, and Professor Aloysius is there, is one of our mentors who talks about that. But then if we keep that, how to understand entire subaltern is something one, but then how do you define subaltern in South Indian context has been one important challenge. So the way he comes through in terms of political representation, one of the very fantastic things he could not do here because of this time paucity that he had shared before coming, that the understanding South Indian in terms of water politics, and then subaltern waters, and then how do we locate in social structure. That is one of the finest things which is coming up, not traditionally just that putting constitutional provisions, what are the affirmative policies which is there, but then it's all about that are South Indians understanding their being as subaltern is very important. In fact, last night, this question comes to the discussion. One of this last evening, we were talking about with Aloysius. Professor Aloysius says that the communities which is living in Southern Indians are subaltern, but then if you look at the kind of everyday behavior, everyday way of handling things, very different from the other lands of the country. So if you go to Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, you have entirely very different communities, including what we call in standard as subaltern. But then these differences are basically very important, which we need to not only document, rather than study them. And thereby, Pian's question is, to me, very important, that is it just documenting the studies, documenting tribals' life is essentially important to understand tribals and tribe as a category, or we need to move beyond that. There was a difficulty when I had spoke to Pian that how he will be talking about, but these difficulties is not in terms of only putting things into southern context, but then how do we understand tribe as a category has been one of the important challenges for all of us throughout these years. But can we move and go to the in terms of locating at micro level? But then, because what I learned from the Deccan studies, some of the studies which I see in Deccan Plateau, Deccan region, some of them are historical studies which shows that we need to have a different gaze, different perspective to understand Southern Indian societies. And thereby, it's not only that when delimitation will take place and then constitutional amendment things may happen, and then the south-north representation may go down. There's something very different. But beyond that, as a student of learning our own society, how do we look at that? That becomes very important. And this is one very serious question which came to me when I was thinking to draft a concept note about this. It took almost long time for me to really have a courage to say in South Indian context, there would be a challenge. And if there are some challenges, that will help us to look at the whole thing, not only political representation, what we talk about, but locating tribal in South Indian context is very important. You have Madras presidency, we have Deccan, Nizam, a long period of governance where documents by sociologists, anthropologists, and people from subaltern researcher communities have not done enough. So we need to locate those from those documents. And perhaps there, the link which came through when Dr. Tausif was talking about her writing, she started writing about this, that how to locate, women in colonial context. That becomes very important because litigants, judiciary, there is something which we feel feared. We really feel out of bound. We do not talk about, except that a student of sociology, many of us will say, what are the, Special Marriages Act, special, different acts are there. But how those acts, those legislation were framed in historical context are very important. Thereby, somebody who work on gender, somebody who talk about subaltern is very important. These stories which is there, I'll be sharing the full paper to all the paper. Those who have contributed, those who have given full length, we will be sharing those full paper. That becomes very important because we talk about Muslim or Dalit as category, and Parda Nashi category is something which is very fascinating to look at. But how do we break? Is it that Parda Nashi, those who are in veil, are again subaltern within the subaltern, or we are trying to say that historically those categories are very different? How do we navigate these concerns are very important. I'm not sure how to go ahead, but I would think that to elaborate more on those Pardanashi categories in historical and colonial context, much more in the context of Dalit and Muslim women, because there the whole larger problem comes when we talk about subaltern women is largely among Dalit and Muslim women. I am not sure how Christian as one of the category panelists would deliberate upon. I leave that questions, but I thought that we need to revisit those studies which are very limited on Christian as a community, and how they could be also, one of the subaltern community, and making a breadth of length in terms of continuity of studies, not from historical context, but then the all anthropological and sociological studies which being taken up in southern India. Can we have some connecting at the present, at the contemporary society? We have many researchers in this hall, and almost 99% research papers which has come up with full paper are focusing South Indian societies. So do we have the relevance of these paper from those, the very earliest studies of anthropology and sociology in southern India? We need to have those connects, and these questions I think can be answered or throw some light by the panelists and the chair and audience. In fact, we do not have much time, but I'll definitely request the chair. In between, we should also have Professor Aloysius comment upon how we are going in terms of locating subaltern in South Indian context. Thank you so much, Dr. Subhan.
Time for the questions. We can have two questions. And the first comments from Professor George. We can have first comment by Professor George Enrichment as Zia has.
I request Professor G. Aloysius to make his comments.
Okay, then we open the house for questions, but please be very questions because we have to wind it up soon. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for giving a chance to ask question. I very much enjoyed your questions. Few question with panel from to Gulam Dastagir Saab. You talk about government and governmentality. In that, it reflection the domination of some class. So in that context, I read about Gramsci cultural hegemony. How you can explain the caste-based marginalization in South India? Another question to Professor Nagaraju sir. What role the colonialism play in shaping the socio-political identity of Dalits in South Asia? My question is in that context, because the British Viceroy Lord Curzon said this all Indian history is all about kings and dynasty. So that can be put in oneself in that context. Third question to Professor Lam Khan sir. Sorry for I wrote down. Sir, as we know, the modern nation state itself based on primordial identity, that is ethnicity. Argument or discourse
Talking about the less representation of Muslims in South. How do you compare it with the case with the North? Okay, especially the in South we have more Muslim parties like IUML, MIM, and all. How do you compare this scenario with the North?
Representation and agency for subaltern communities.
And intriguing questions. So the question about caste, when we speak about caste, as we know, in the Indian pan-Indian phenomena, it is not only about Hindus, but also Muslims, Christians also have caste, we know them. When you speak about caste, most of the studies have spoken about caste as an economic system, as a cultural system, and also we talk about the occupational kind of integration which happens with caste. But then there is one more component of caste which has to be still, I guess, which Professor Nagaraj also rightly pointed out. We need to talk about caste in terms of power. Okay, the power dimension that comes up with caste, as Professor Nagaraj said, that when you talk about village community, we say there are three elements of Indian social structure. Without those, Indian society cannot be understood, which is village community, caste system, and joint family system. But all these three have been portraying the life of the culture of the dominant castes. All right. So whether it is joint family system or caste system or, in fact, village community, because in the village community, what was described as village life is something which is always excluding the Dalit who are residing outside the village. All right. So this is a kind of an arrangement which we need to revisit. And then one more thing which we need to understand with regard to this caste system is this. I would take it, I think it needs to be articulated in an academic environment. By talking about caste in most of the sociological discourses, it looks like socializing the people to understand what is caste and go back to the same kind of ashrama system, pushada system, learn it age after age, generation after generation. We are all learning that. And I guess we are trying to reinstate that. So this is the idea of power which works. What we need to understand is not the one which has been already there with the dominant system of life, but then the caste system has to be understood how it had affected, what consequences it had to the people who are subaltern, especially Dalits, tribe, and very particularly Muslims and Christians also do have caste, and there also, as we know, Dalit Christians, the Pasta Muslims, what kind of issues they face, all based on the dimension of power. And then another question about Muslim representation. As we know, we have Muslim representation in Indian Parliament. We have 24 Muslims being representing out of 543 seats in the Indian Parliament in 2024 onwards. Of this, 5 seats, 5 MPs are from South India. How these 5 MPs? I would say it is 4 only, because 1 MP comes from Lakshadweep, which is reserved for scheduled tribes. And because the Muslims in Lakshadweep are considered to be tribes, they occupy that seat, and then we are counting them as Muslim. but that is a seat which is reserved for ST, and that is basically they should be counted as tribes. And what we have other seats, one from Tamil Nadu, two from Kerala, and one from Telangana. Okay, this is the way the MPs are representing South India, Muslims of South India in Indian Parliament. So this is a catastrophe which is happening, and a sequential wave, we can say, from 2004 onwards, there has been a steady decline also. For example, in 2004, the representation of Muslims in all India seats, it was 26, of which 7 were from South India. Now it has come down to 5 out of 24. So this is the way the representation of Muslims in Indian Parliament from South India has been steadily, meticulously, systematically declining. That is a trend which calls for understanding them as a subaltern community. Hope done. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Eleanor Gillette, in her work From Untouchable to Dalit, where she argued that the touch of a white man was worked as a social healing. So when you look at the colonial state with reference to untouchability, the colonial state was primarily responsible for introducing some of the social reforms, especially the legal reforms, which in a way shaped the future of the untouchable population of India. I think that's where we also need to refer to the writings of Professor G. Aloysius as well as Professor Surendra Singh Jodhkar, where they argued that caste is a power. So therefore, what are the legal interventions which are primarily introduced at different historical junctures? Only in the modern India, after the colonial rule, the idea of a legal interventions and conjunctions came into practice. So therefore, because of the, let's say, the anti-caste agenda articulated by different reformers, and especially Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, which got some kind of legal protections in the Indian Constitution in the post-independent era. So this is where, that's where I wish to argue that the colonial anthropology or colonial policies have shaped the making of a Dalit from the untouchable, from untouchable to Dalit. That is my response. So the second point, when you're talking about the knowledge and hegemony, which refers to the subaltern studies and the role of agency, I definitely agree with you that when you're talking about the subaltern studies, most of the subaltern studies are primarily represented by non-subalterns on the subaltern. So the idea is that the agency was missing in the initial days, but over a period of time, especially for the last 20 years, there are a group of scholars among the subalterns have emerged, and they're trying to articulate their intellectual agenda. So in a sense, one can say that in the post-2000, one can find the agency among the subaltern communities. They're trying to represent their own voices. So therefore, there is a positive atmosphere which is going on in the Indian academia for the last 20 years, if not 30 years. So regarding the last question regarding my friend Dr. Naik, we are talking about the scheduled caste and the classification. So Professor Aloysius and other scholars, they always argue that we are talking about the Indian state. The Indian state is primarily belong to the dominant caste, as well as they were known for occupying the diverse spaces of the bureaucracy, as well as the political space, cultural space, everything. But so therefore, we always see a kind of competition among the, let's say, dominant caste, from the traditional dominant caste to the aspirational dominant caste, which comes from the subalterns, which comes from the Shudra communities. So once upon a time, the dominant caste were from the Brahmin, let's say the upper strata Savarna communities, but Savarna to now Shudra. But the basic ideology is that both these Savarna and Shudra, they try to retain the ideology of the dominant value system. So when you come to the question of the scheduled caste, why one need to talk about the rationalization of reservations is all about the fact that we need to talk about the remaining 98 marginal communities. Because even after 75 years of independence, have you seen any third caste or any fourth caste among Dalits who are part of high school? Forget about even college or university. So therefore, despite of, let's say, the different kinds of ideological contestations, we need to understand this very idea of a Dalit subclassification from the perspective of the margin.
Yeah, to be very, very brief, primordialism, especially those ethno-nationalists or the nationalists who strive for sovereignty, will claim in that terms. But the ex-colonies or the former colonies, most of the nation state are colonial construct only, and then the kind of whatever they administer, that becomes it. And then in the northeastern area, especially nowadays, Northeast is, which I always claim in some of my writing also, Northeast is yet to be decolonized, because whatever for their administrative and military conveniences, they create those boundaries are not really dismantled and then restructured of the delimitations is not done. Just like reorganization is being done in the mainland, Northeast it is not done because there is a kind of a give and take in the reorganization that has been done in the mainland, so to say. And then, but over there, all the administrative units are being protected till now. That's why some of the Nagas will claim that some part of Assam, that is Naga district, all those various districts in Arunachal, the same thing, the Kokichin group will do the same thing. The Mizo will say that some part of Churchanpur is all theirs. If we look at the colonial map also, it is Lusai Hill. Now it is becoming part of Manipur. So all these things is something which is not being done. So decolonization is something which they are shouting for, and then their aspirations is coming along with them.
Thank you, Professor Pia. Gulam Deputy, you want to speak first? Then I'll.
So I would like to give a very important context. The idea that we are talking about South Indian subaltern is part of a larger community, which we call it as a global community. What kind of deprivation are happening here? We know that globalization is something that what Anthony Giddens would say, what happens 1,000 miles away also can affect the people in 1,000 miles away. So this is the situation that we are into. 1966, United Nations Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. The name of the covenant is Civil and Political Rights. It talks about the rights of the minorities. It talks about the rights of the minorities, saying that minorities can have socio-economic, cultural, religious, and public sphere participation. Socio-economic, educational, cultural, religious, public participation rights. But very specifically and systematically, the element of political participation and representation was systematically ignored by the United Nations itself in 1966 itself. Then we were waiting to see that in 1992, when it was ratified into UN Declaration of Rights, there we were expecting that there would be some change. But even this 1992 United Nations Declaration of Rights also voiced the same idea, saying that the minorities can have social rights, economic rights, religious rights, cultural rights, and educational rights, and participation in public participation rights. And the political participation of the rights of minorities was also declined by the United Nations Declaration of Rights. And that has a reflection in all the countries in the world. That is one of the reasons why subaltern can't think of competing with a dominant capitalistic kind of society. That is where we have to have this context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Before I call the chair for her comments, ma'am, you can answer the question with your comments as a chair also. So I now request Professor Arvinder A. Ansari to put her comments as a chair of this plenary session. Thank you so much. And I thank all the panelists for making a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shabada. I know you all are waiting for lunch, and I'll not stand in between, but yeah, I need to respond to his question also. And I would also say that this is a very, very enriching session. And very important thing is that we have been talking about minority studies, but when we talk about minority studies, under the rubric of subaltern studies, it becomes very important. And I really congratulate the organizers, Professor Ziauddin and Professor Amina Tehseen, of thinking of, approaching, looking at sociology from a very different gaze. And I always felt, this was my personal opinion, that we have to have a comparative study where we need to understand The narratives from South also is very important, because when we talk about minority study, we talk it from the lens of North India. It is centralized, it is problematized in the discourse and in debate. And what you raised is very important, that how academia can address the question of subalternization, whether it is Dalits, tribes, minorities. A very important common thread which is running through these communities is basically exclusion, marginalization, and what, even Professor Nagaraju was saying, that when we study subaltern, how do we study subaltern? Who studies subaltern is also very important. Professor Eloises also pointed out that the process of subalternization is very important, and if we look, we all feel excluded. But the exclusion of minorities, and especially what Professor Ghulam Dastagir is pointing out, the political representation of the minorities, and especially Muslim minorities, since 2004 is something which is pushing the community. Now we have the discourses on subalterns, we have the discourse on Dalit testimonies, autoethnographics, rich accounts. But I'm surprised when I was looking at the literature to find something similar when we talk about religious communities. I don't find that discourse there. And I think this conference becomes very important in that terms, that we have to document this discourse. What even, Tausif was pointing about, the intersectionality of patriarchy and customary laws, the understanding of Indian state, the colonial understanding of Indian state. They wanted to capture polity and economy, but wanted to maintain a distance from culture. From culture, and that and that was their estrangement from the culture, which they could not understand. They wanted to bring in the Victorian legislation, which kind of disturbed our own understanding. And how the intersectionality, I'm going to talk about in my valedictory address, that intersectionality of caste, class, religion, ethnicity is very pervasive. And when we talk about subaltern, within subalterns, the gendered aspect of it also becomes very important. The role of academia is very important, because if we have methodologies which are interpretative, which are transformative, then it will definitely bring a change. As we have seen, we have lot of documentation which is there. Very interesting article by Meenakshi Thapan in one of the journals, where she has narratives coming from Valmiki community, coming from gender perspective, which are talking about their experiences, and it helps us to understand the stand positionality from the vantage point of the oppressed. And when oppressed writes about the oppression, it is a holistic understanding of exclusion and marginality. I think I will not take much time, but I will congratulate all the paper panelists. It was wonderful, enriching discussion, and the diversity of the papers has enriched my understanding, my learning, and I'm sure it might have also impacted, you all there. And it is a learning experience, and I'm sure in the next sessions we will have much more enlightened presentations, where we would, have debates, discussions on understanding not only subaltern studies, but also the process of subalternization. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Surely we'll continue with the discussion. We have a panel discussion, technical session at 2:30 p.m. I request all of you to have lunch and come soon after lunch at 2:30. Before we end up, I request Dr. Bibekanand to please hand over the certificate and memento to our panelists. I request the chair of the session to do this honor. Professor Dastagir, just wait for a moment. I request Professor Ansari ma'am to do the honor to give away the mementos and the certificate to our panelists, and Dr. K.M. Ziaddin to accompany her. Sure, sure.
Yes, sir, he's the main person. Yes, sir, he's a couple of karma. Yeah, we'll start. Yes, already. I scheduled 2 o'clock. Now I have to do it by 2:50. Babuchan, one by one.
Sir, sir. Next is yours. Come, come,
Jia bhai,
come.
kids. Madam. Yeah. I'm Nagaraj.
Yeah. अच्छा ऐसे ही दे दो, मैं दे देती हूँ.
Thank you so much, madam. Thank you so much. Then,
Yeah.
Piyan.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. तौसीफ सर का भी है क्या? मैम
Piyan, 1 minute. One. Come on, please. Radha, madam, come. Come on, Rekha, come. Come.
oh my goodness.
Come on, Rekha, please come. Arey, no. Please come. You have to follow inclusive photography. Come.
Ma'am, आइए.
Come. Sir.